Angola's Supreme Court ordered on Tuesday the preventive seizure of assets of Isabel dos Santos, daughter of former President Eduardo dos Santos, who died last year. This is the second seizure of Isabel dos Santos' assets in Angola since 2019. The court order covers 100% of the shares of the company Embalvidro, of which the defendant is the beneficial owner, as well as the balances of all bank accounts owned or co-owned by the daughter of the former Angolan president. Also included Isabel dos Santos' shares in mobile networks in Mozambique, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe. This includes 70% of the shares of the Mozambican telecommunications company, Mstar, of which Isabel dos Santos is the effective beneficiary, as well as 100% of the companies Unitel Plus in Cape Verde and Unitel STP in São Tomé and Príncipe were also seized. According to the Supreme Court, the businesswoman damaged the Angolan state in over €1 billion in other criminal cases with evidence of embezzlement, influence peddling, economic participation in companies, and money laundering. The decision by the Angolan Supreme Court was based on documents from state-owned company Sonangol and mobile phone company Unitel, as well as information provided by Portuguese and Dutch authorities. Now, joining us to make sense of all of this and discuss this issue is Marisa Lourenço. She's a political and economic risk analyst. She joins in from Johannesburg in South Africa. I also have Gonçalo, our a communications consultant and political analyst. He joins from Lisbon in Portugal. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining us on the conversation.
Hi, Gbenga. Thanks for having us on the show.
Now, thanks a lot for the invite.
You're welcome. Now, I'd like to start with you, Marisa. Isabel dos Santos has faced corruption accusations for years, and it's not the first time that Angola's Supreme Court is ordering the seizure of her assets. What's your reaction to this latest order?
So you're correct that it's not the first time that they've looked at seizing her assets. And what we're saying is both a continuation of the action that incumbent President Lourenço, a bit of a ramping up where he's making, it seems to be for now at least, as he enters into the first few months of his second term in office, a much more concerted effort to really get these funds away from her. It could be, to help, but I think that we're going to see a very heavy push towards targeting Isabel dos Santos.
Okay, thank you. Marisa, I'd like to bring Gonçalo into the picture. Gonçalo, Isabel dos Santos was once named by Forbes magazine as the richest woman in Africa. Who is she, and how did she come about amassing such a massive fortune?
She was, as you say, the most richest African woman. I don't know if at this time she still maintains that stature, but she comes about it as in a certain way. She studied in good schools and good universities, and that was all provided to her, and it was provided in a natural sense. But also, and what has worried most countries and people over the last decades is that there's been lots of state money used for resources in which it wasn't supposed to be used, and I think that the main decision from today, from yesterday, regards that is that there's money stolen from the state. None of this is new. There's also various prosecutions that state, besides money laundering, economic favoriness, a number of things which has always been in the public eye since 2010, 2011, and naturally it kind of got stronger and much more judicial after Eduardo dos Santos left power, and since 2019, 2020.
So this is not the first time, staying with you, Gonçalo, this is not the first time that assets will be seized. They were seized in 2019. Would you say, what's the reason for this current seizure? Would you say that the prosecutors didn't know that she had all this other assets? And why are we seeing this new order for seizure of assets and properties?
Well, I think that the main game changer here in this becoming so serious and kind of making it hard for Isabel dos Santos to have a defense in any rational way here is the mandate sent by Interpol, the red notice that it sent more or less a month ago. And that was kind of a signal of an international cooperation that went way beyond Angola, of what has been happening in the country, and of all the assets that are stolen or state owned. I also think that with this decision, one of the main differences from the seizure in 2019, is that it kind of speaks of it mainly regards assets in other countries like Mozambique, São Tomé, and Cape Verde, and that kind of puts us in a situation where we're facing also a geopolitical aspect here, which is, are these countries on board? Are these assets that Isabel dos Santos has in these countries like Cape Verde, Mozambique, and São Tomé, are the attorney generals in these countries well aware that with this decision, these assets can be taken from her in these states? I believe that this decision will be made by the Supreme Court of Angola without an international consultation, without an international cooperation, even from the Attorney General from Portugal, which I know has also had straight cooperation with the one in Angola. So I'm kind of leaning towards the fact that this all obliges a judicial international cooperation.
Okay. Thank you, Gonçalo. I'd like to bring in Marisa in Johannesburg. Marisa, Isabel dos Santos has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing, and last month she told CNN Portugal that the courts in Angola were not independent and judges were used to fulfill a political agenda. What are your thoughts on this defense of her?
So one thing that Isabel dos Santos is very good at is PR, and she hires some of... When Isabel dos Santos comes out and says, on this interview that you mentioned on CNN Portugal, that the courts are not independent in Angola, that's not a lie. Angola is a struggling democracy. The MPLA, total transparency, all of those kinds of things that we've come to expect with, countries that have had their democratic process kind of disrupted. But what she's good at is taking an element of the truth and then twisting it to suit her. It is undeniable, essentially, that Isabel dos Santos, along with her late husband, Sindika Dikolo, came out in a very famous investigation called the Luanda Leaks in January 2020, which was by the ICIJ, a consortium of journalists that specifically look into these kinds of issues. And it's really worrying, essentially, that I think to some extent the Angolan state is definitely targeting.
Okay, Marisa, we seem to be having some issues with your internet connection. We'll try and sort it out and get back to you soon. So, Gonçalo, I'd like you to pick up from where Marisa left off. She said she was talking about the justice system in Angola has not been independent, and of Isabel dos Santos being very good at public relations. You also did mention that this trial will have to involve geopolitics, the former colonial masters, Portugal, and also Sao Tome and Principe, Mozambican government, and other places where she has a business interest and where some of these assets are located. What are the chances of Isabel dos Santos getting a free and fair trial if she returns to Angola?
Yeah, I think Marisa stated well from what I was able to hear. The situation in Angola concerning there's some kind of discomfort with the judicial aspect of the country, and even Elder Peter Grosz, which is the Attorney General in Angola, his taken to a new mandate was obviously very. Most people didn't look at it in the best sense. And there's always that worrying, and I think that Isabel dos Santos naturally uses that very well, as he's also stated that this is a political prosecution, that this is a political, she even stated in CNN Portugal that this is a way for João Lourenço to anticipate that she will never be a presidential candidate in Angola. However, again, I do think that these decisions from the Supreme Court, this decision from the Supreme Court, and all these investigations have an international side to them. With Holland, Portugal, with even these African countries. What I do think is that the next step for the Supreme Court of Angola and even for Attorney General is to have these countries aligned, which we don't know yet. Is Portugal aligned in these assets being taken from her and relocated to the Angolan state? Is Cape Verde aligned in these assets being relocated to the Angolan state, Mozambique, and so on? And I think that's the next step that is essential for the prosecution. I also think that we have more than evidence, public evidence. I don't want to go into the judicial aspects because I'm not specialized there, but I think we have more than public evidence since many years ago that there was money laundering in many aspects, and I think that the job done by the international consortium of journalists with the leaks was also made a very strong case with more than 700 documents released, and there were undeniable aspects of money laundering and corruption to them. However, the also strange thing I do agree with Marisa in a certain sense that Isabel dos Santos has good PR in a certain sense, but I also think that PR can do good can be good until a certain stage, and reaching the stage where if she doesn't collaborate, be it from wherever she is that no one knows, and seeing her defense in a stronger way, there's no PR that can survive that, and I think that's the main issue here also at the moment.
There's only a certain level that public relations can drive you to. Marisa, are there other members of the Dos Santos family and members of the old regime under her father that have been indicted for corruption? Because she seems to be the only one whose name keeps popping up.
So she's definitely not the only one who's had assets seized since Lourenço came into office. She's definitely the most high-profile one, and she's definitely the most vocal one. But there were other cases. For example, her brother Zanu, he also was ordered to pay back money to the state several years ago. We also had former generals that also had stakes in Unital. Their stakes were recently seized by the state. But one thing I will say in terms of where Isabel dos Santos is not necessarily trying to wash over the truth, and that is that she is definitely targeted with a lot more vigor than other individuals that have been accused of corruption. So if we look at the current makeup of the MPLA, we do see some very problematic figures still hovering around. We've got the former vice president, Manuel Vicente. He was vice president under the former president, dos Santos. And Portugal tried to bring up corruption charges against him several years ago, and Lourenço really forced them to drop it. And, like saying that the country didn't respect Angola's sovereignty. And it showed the extent to which Lourenço is prepared to fight corruption, but only as long as it's politically expedient. And at the moment, it's not politically expedient to, lend a hand to Isabel dos Santos. And I think that if you look at the case of Manuel Vicente, his immunity, so he's immune from prosecution for 5 years after he leaves office. That immunity is coming to an end. And I think that will put a lot of pressure on the sort of the questions around, is Lourenço really genuine about his fight in corruption when he speaks about Isabel dos Santos, or again, is it political expediency?
Thank you, Marisa. Gonçalo, in November, global police agency Interpol issued a red notice for Isabel dos Santos. The million-dollar question is, do we know her whereabouts? Have you seen her in Algarve and shopping malls in Lisbon? Who knows where she is at this moment?
Yeah. I think no one knows where she is at this moment. Probably you can ask CNN Portugal might know, because she gave an interview a few weeks ago to CNN Portugal. So I would say that possibly only one reporter from that station knows where she is. No, but
and has she been communicating with the outside world and in the past?
Yeah. I don't. Yes, I think she communicates, from what I know, through social media every day almost. And you can never understand where her whereabouts are. But one of the things that I noticed is that 1 month ago, the general attorney in Portugal stated quite clearly, the vice prosecutor in Portugal stated quite clearly that she couldn't also be in Portuguese ground, because she would be taken to Angola in the same day. So there's talks that she might be in London. If I would have to bet on one place, to be honest, and I don't think it would be Dubai or anything. I think it would be Russia at this moment, and I honestly think that might be looked into journalistically, so to speak.
Okay. So, but you've established the fact that Portugal does have an extradition treaty with Angola, and if she's found in Portugal, she will be taken to Luanda.
Exactly.
Yes. Now, Marisa, what made it so easy for Isabel dos Santos to amass such a huge amount of wealth where there are no institutional checks and, balances?
So essentially, when her father was entering what would be his last term in office, that was when he really kind of ramped up, I would say, state looting and just entrenched his authority in a way that it had not quite been entrenched before. And at that time, then that's when he started to place his children at the head of these state-owned enterprises. And it was a way for him to keep control of the economy, and it was a way to make his family very, very wealthy as well. This is not to take away from Isabel dos Santos' business credentials. I think, as Gonçalo said earlier, she did benefit from having a very good education, a very good upbringing with all of the resources that brings. But, someone who has shares in every single state company, I mean, at one point, she was the chairman of Sonangol, which is, that's typically a role for a technocrat. And, there was a lot of kind of dos Santos maneuvering around also, so that by the time he left office, he thought, well, his children will be in key positions, his allies will be in key positions, and he'll be safe. And essentially, when Lourenço came into power in 2017, I think it did come as quite a shock to him, when Lourenço fired Isabel from Sonangol, and when he launched these corruption proceedings. So it didn't quite go as planned, but that's really how it began and how it actually got so bad.
Thank you, Marisa. Gonçalo, still talking on the subject of President Lourenço, upon resumption of office, he promised to fight corruption in Angola. Marisa seems to believe that, he's a bit selective in his fight against corruption. How will you rate his performance in this area, his fight against corruption?
Yeah, I kind of see it as the same way as Marisa, and I think that actually when I was here on News Central after on the day of the elections in Angola, that was something that I reinforced, was that one of the problems with LEA and even after João Lourenço taking office was that in a very short amount of time, of a time frame, people noticed that most of his witch hunt was too selective. And that kind of goes in favor, if you want, of Isabel dos Santos' defense. They can use that, and also in terms of PR, that it's too selective, and that kind of also that kind of it kind of made people feel away from the MPLA at that time, when most Angolans were hoping that there would actually be a change in the party. They promised that change, but it didn't occur in the broadest sense that it could have occurred. It was a kind of selective witch hunt, without any doubt, until then.
Okay, thank you, Gonçalo. Now, Marisa, as the MPLA as a party made an official position on the case of grand corruption under the Dos Santos government, and have they said anything about the travails of Isabel dos Santos as a party? What's their position?
Well, essentially, João Lourenço has said that he's going to carry on, with his political and economic reform agenda, and implicit in that statement is that he's going to conduct his second term much like he's conducted his first term. I think that typically, though, the Angolan government, they tend to keep quiet on matters like this, in the sense of they like to be the opposite of what Isabel dos Santos does. So while she speaks to the media and she does interviews and things like that, it just quietly works in the background, getting the case ready, moving the courts, and things like that. I think another thing to remember, you mentioned at the beginning of the show about how Isabel dos Santos said she could never be president. I mean, this is not because of Lourenço. This is because she is no longer welcome, really, by any members of the MPLA or anything like that. So they might not be as vocal about something like that, but she doesn't have any political support in Angola anymore.
What about those loyalists of her father's government? Are they still not in government?
So most of the loyalists essentially have either, said that they'll support Lourenço in his regime change. They are lurking in the background, not as powerful as they once were, but the ones that are still there are really the reason, essentially, that Lourenço only made those kind of selective changes that we were talking about, because you can't upset the old order too much, else the entire party will collapse.
True.
So they're still around, but their allegiance has switched, and they've tried to do some of what Lourenço wants, some of what the outside world wants, so that Angola can get more business and more investment in. But at the end of the day, even those that were loyal to her father were not necessarily loyal to Isabel dos Santos, because remember that here is a woman coming in with limited experience and being given like the top position at the state-owned oil company. It never really sat well with anyone else, and I mean, essentially, dos Santos stepped down, and I think that a lot of people weren't really happy with his behavior towards the end of his rule.
Now, finally, Gonçalo, do you think Isabel dos Santos will be returning to Angola anytime soon to clear her name? Because she said, it's a politically motivated trial and all of that. How do you see this playing out?
To clear her name, I think it would take a long time if she would be able to clear her name. I think that unless she's found and she's taken to Angola arrested, I don't see her going in a good will or in a good sense back to the country. So it's kind of a worrying situation, and it's kind of a very, very out of the box situation where you have this daughter of such a relevant figure in Angola, such a controversial figure in Angola, but when she was so relevant in Angola, also in a bad and for some people still in Angola in a good sense, because she also provided jobs for many. But I think, as Marisa was stating, as Marisa stated, I think that her ground in Angola, the way the majority of the population see her today is very, very negative. Okay. And it's not. It's always been divisive, even when Eduardo dos Santos was in the presidency, because there was always news. The United States have been investigating Isabel dos Santos since 2012, 2013. In 2021, they also said that she wouldn't be allowed to go into the country. So I don't see her going back to the country unless obliged completely in a more rough sense.
Okay. Thank you, Gonçalo. I'd like Marisa to have the final say here. Her father that used to protect her is no more. Her husband is no more. The MPLA senior cadre seems to have switched allegiance to President Lourenço. Do you see her returning, and how do you see this playing out as we wrap up the conversation?
So I definitely don't see her returning to Angola. The one practical reason is that there isn't an arrest warrant out for her. And I think what we also saw that when it was her father's funeral a few months ago, she actually didn't go to Angola. She was obviously worried about being arrested, but she also just didn't feel safe or feel welcome attending that state funeral. I think we will see her mostly operate through her social media and through her PR firm going forward. I think another important thing to remember about Isabel dos Santos is that at the time when her shares from the state telecommunications company were being seized from Unitel, she launched a massive PR campaign to say that she was being targeted by the state, but she kind of gave in without a fight. And I think that we're going to see this here because she knows that she is implicated in some severe wrongdoing. So this is more about protecting her image, but I think behind the scenes she will concede some of the money that is alleged to have been stolen.
Thank you very much, Marisa Lourenço, political and economic risk analyst who joined in from Johannesburg, South Africa, and also Gonçalo Teles, communications consultant and political analyst, joining from Lisbon in Portugal. It was nice having you both on the conversation. We do appreciate your time, insights, and contribution to the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gbenga.
You're watching The Conversation in News Central Television, where we return from the break. President Ramaphosa seeks to stop former President Zuma's private prosecution bid. We'll bring you more details of that after this break. Do stay with us.